Welcome to this episode of Silverback Publishing's In Conversation with Steve Stratton, as we give you a look beyond the page in anticipation of the release of his novella, A Warrior's Path. I am your host, A.M. Adair, and today Steve and I are joined by the incredible Don Bentley. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks
You
for
ready to get
having
into
us.
it? Yeah? All right. I know that time is precious, so we'll go ahead and kick things off. I mean, Silverback's doing something pretty cool with bringing new stories in the form of novellas to the market. There aren't too many people who are doing this. I would go so far as to say they're doing it in a unique way. So let's talk novellas. What do you think of that medium? Like, Steve, you decided to make, Lance Bear Wolf's origin story a novella. How did that come to be?
Well, I like the format because I don't get to that middle that middle piece like in a regular novel where I'm thinking, now how am I going to keep the reader engaged? Plus, I wanted to keep it crisp without, going on and just having him be, a chest full of exploits kind of idea. Wanted to make it succinct, more succinct than I usually write, let's say.
Okay, that's fair enough. You do tend to write some pretty epic stories, and Dawn, I mean, you're churning out pages like crazy. I mean, I am a little hesitant to ask, how do you feel about novellas? Could there be one in the future?
Well, I think it's a really cool medium. I mean, I want to be Brad Taylor when I grow up, and I think he has written 47 novellas and 53 books at this point. And it's actually neat the way he uses them. When he was cranking through 2 books a day, or 2 books a day, probably 2 books a year, and then he would do 1 or 2 novellas, and they were kind of just fun things for the fans or ways to fill in pieces between the books. And I think it's also a really great way to keep fans engaged. When you're only turning out 1 book a year, you give them something else to look forward to. So I think it's a really neat medium. I don't know that I think it's really, whoever it was, Mark Twain said that I wrote you a letter that's 2 pages or 9 pages long because I didn't have the time to write you one that was 2. And that's kind of how I look at novellas, is I'm not sure I have the gift to be able to squash down a story that small, but I think it's a cool idea.
That's a unique perspective. I've never thought of it from that angle, that it does require a little bit more succinctity with your storytelling. It's like, but I mean, is there room in one of your worlds for a novella, perhaps?
Yeah, I think probably. I think when you're writing a book, there's always, or at least when I do, I have tons that I end up leaving on the chopping block. And I think it just doesn't fit for the story, or it's too much of a distraction for that particular one. And so I think we probably all have, as writers, that little drawer full of chopping block stories that didn't quite make it into the book that you're like, man, that'd be cool to be able to bring that to life. And so I think there probably is some. Do you have novellas too, Emma?
I actually do. And that's a similar thing. I had a storyline that just didn't fit for the books that I was writing. And, I couldn't let go of it. So I went ahead and wrote it out, and it ended up being a novella, pretty dark.
Nice.
And, you guys might see it later this year. Um,
Nice.
but, that being said, that gives us the opportunity to play with different storylines and different characters. And, when you have a series, making that shift to something new can be a bit refreshing. Let's see. Now, Steve, you just signed a book deal for an entirely new series, right?
Yeah,
Yes, thank you.
congratulations, Steve.
Thank you very much.
It's
It
like,
Yeah, something else. When in between writing the Shadow Tears series, I just had this idea pop into my brain, started writing notes down, and eventually it became enough notes that I started off with a new series, a female protagonist and a patient of hers that she has to go on a mission with. And I thought, okay, here's a different plot. And it's exciting because it allows me to um, get off the shadow tier, the drug cartels for a bit, maybe get a little bit more mainstream since my last name's not Winslow. And I can, explore other options, other characters. And I've even thought of using novellas for that, as like to explore other characters and things like that without the big commit of doing, 80 to 90,000 words of thriller.
So, I mean, jumping from world to world, Don, you could give a master class. You really could. You're not only had your own world, but now you have jumped into other worlds that have already been built. So,
Yeah.
I mean, that's complicated in itself. I mean, what kind of tips and tricks do you use to help you get going? And maybe for those of us who are shifting series?
Yeah, so the first thing that's good to have is children who will work below the minimum wage. Because what I did for mine, and if I could get it, maybe I can get it without destroying it. So when I asked Mark Graney for the Bible for the Clancy books, he said, "I'll give you what I have." And what he had was this. And so it's this monster book that Mark did that to. And each one of those tabs corresponds to some character's hair color or the gun that Jack Ryan Jr. likes or somebody's knife. And so I said, thanks. And then gave it to my daughter. And I'm like, I'll pay you $20 an hour to take that and turn it into a Bible. And so she kind of did. It was pretty funny looking at her notes because she'd be like, I think this is a gun, but I don't know what it is. And so that was the Bible for the Clancy series. And luckily I had Tom Colgan as the editor, who has been the editor forever and could kind of serve as the guardrails. And for the Clancy ones, they actually have every now and then what they call series continuity writers. And so after you do your first pass, or in between maybe your copy edits and first pass pages, they have one more reader who will go through and say, actually, Jack Ryan doesn't have, or Jack Ryan Jr. doesn't have two sisters and a brother. He has two brothers and a sister or something like that. And so they kind of save your bacon. And then luckily for the Mitch Rapp, Vince Flynn series, Kyle is a machine when it comes to both writing and being organized. And so he kind of said, well, what do you want? And I'm like, everything you got. And he's like, well, be careful what you ask for. And he sent me this link to a Google Drive, and it was like just documents that were his notes. And then something he did that was really smart is he asked the editor for the Word versions of the original ones that Vince wrote. So you can go through and search character names and do kind of global stuff. But it definitely is. When I write, when I get stuck on something, I just put two capital X's, and I can search for those later. And either I don't want to do the research now, or I don't know. And the Mitch one, Capture or Kill, I just turned in. I had just tons and tons of stuff where I'm like, I think it's this character, but I'm not sure. And I'm not. And so it was a lot more. It's a little disheartening when you're like, okay, I'm done. And you do that global search for double X and you come up with 3,000 of them or something. And you're like, why? And so that's how I do it. I don't recommend that approach.
I was saying, Steve, aren't you still doing the old school? Don't you have like string theory in your office, like with Post-it notes and red lines?
Yeah,
Beautiful mind.
That one of the first videos I ever did was Shadow Tier with about 300 sticky notes on a whole wall of cookbooks, like 1,600 cookbooks my wife has. And it was that kind of thing, or that Mel Gibson conspiracy movie, right? I was like, trying to pull it together. But I do a similar thing. I use 3 X's because I will just write and I can't remember Dr. Li Feng, blah, blah, blah. And I just put X's in. And I have green highlights, yellow highlights. They used to mean something, not so much anymore. But I'm always just writing forward and thinking, I'll do like Don, I'll clean it up later. And,
famous last words.
Exactly. Beta readers, thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, I mean, that's essentially what your continuity writers are doing for you, Don, is like, that's like putting it out to the Thrillerverse and saying, hey, fans, does this also flow? Because I'm certain there are sites that are dedicated to everything that is, the Clancy universe, Jack and, Jack, Jr., not to mention Mitch Rapp. So those details really do matter. Now, have you guys had bleed over between those series?
Yeah, so I'll say again, I'm always talking about what a great editor Tom Colgan is because he's fantastic. But I was lucky enough to have him for both my Matt Drake books and then my Jack Ryan Jr. ones. And so my first Jack Ryan Jr. one, it was hard for me to kind of get his voice right and figure out who he was. And this is a little bit of writer inside baseball stuff, but my Matt Drake ones are first person, which means Matt is the one telling you the story. It's I. And so the Jack Ryan Jr., our third person, that puts a little bit of distance. And so it was kind of helpful, but there were sections in there where I would get back Tom's comments and he's like, this is not what Jack Ryan would say. This is Matt. Like, you can't say this to him. Take that out. So he was dinging me on that. And then the other thing I got was not another 80s song, and you cannot quote Top Gun again. And I'm like, can you really quote Top Gun too many times? I don't think so, but apparently there's a rule in New York that says you can't. So there you go.
Well, this is where I get to put in my little bit of, dig at YouTube, because Top
Here
Gun,
it
again,
comes.
Navy movie that is widely regarded as being superior 80s movie, and you guys, Army cats, you're just recognizing greatness.
I'm surprised you've never seen this cinematic gem called Firebirds that had Nicolas Cage and Apaches, and it was, I mean, I'm not saying it dominated Top Gun, but it kind of dominated Top Gun.
Somewhere Nick Cage is just like, wait, somebody's speaking my name.
Somebody saw that movie? What? Yeah.
No, this is, you have strong characters, both of you. You have multiple worlds that you're playing with now. And, Steve, I don't know how much you want to go into Snowman right now, but when it comes to character development, you've kind of branched out in a unique way where your character is actually infiltrating other people's stories. So you have Lance Bear Wolf magically appearing in like other environments, maybe working with some other covert operatives. So now, how likely is it, I should say, that he's going to find his way into your new series?
I'm actually working on Snowman 2 right now, and Lance Bearwolf might be in and around the White House in a national security way. Mainly because of the timeline. My first book started in 98, so Lance is getting old. And as much as he'd like to operate and think we're still cool, and I can relate to this, I've got all the gear, but I'm not hanging with the young guys. So Lance, I've got to, like happened with the Jack Ryan series, I've got to mature Lance. Now, Mitch Rapp is a different character, right? He's time travels and other things. So but yeah, it's fun to do that in just little spotlights where it makes sense, where there's an intersection that makes sense for the story, not just to throw names in.
And that's fair. So now I would actually, we talked Jack and Mitch, but Matt, as far as Matt Drake goes, if he were to, say, make a cameo in another character's world, who would it be?
That's a good question. So there was actually, I get that all the time because the normal people who aren't reader or writers, like all us weird folks, they're like, why can't you have Mitch Rapp and Scott Harvath and Pike Logan all throwing down together? And you're like, that it wouldn't work from the IP perspective.